Thank you, Janine. I'm not sure if my video will show up because Kimberly's sharing screen, but I'm Gale Stam and I will be presenting the overview for our study. Kimberly will be presenting the study and the instruction, and I will be presenting some of the results. So we know that there's scant evidence that L2 learners can shift their thinking for speaking patterns about motion events from their L1 pattern to that of an L2. They still exhibit some L1 patterns in thinking for speaking about motion events in the L2, not only in their verbal production, but also in their accompanying hand gestures. And I will talk about gestures a bit more in a moment. And this is true even for L2 learners with extensive immersion exposure to a new language. The perspective we take is that speech and gesture are a single integrated system and that they represent two aspects of thought, the verbal and the imagistic. I need to explain what I mean by gestures here. I mean the movements of our hands we make when we're talking. And I'm not talking about culturally specific gestures. I know that you probably can't see me, but I'm actually making a gesture right now. These two aspects, speech and gesture, they represent two aspects of thought, the verbal and the imagistic. They express the same meanings as well as perform the same pragmatic functions. They develop from a growth point, which combines the static and dynamic aspects of language. So the growth point is Vygotsky's notion of a psychological predicate, inner speech extended. You can think of a growth point as the kernel or seed of thinking. And speech and gesture develop from the growth point and influence each other. David McNeil et al. Sums it up perfectly. It is the initial unit of thinking for speaking, out of which a dynamic process of utterance level and discourse level organization emerges. Imagery and spoken form are mutually influencing. It is not that imagery is the input to spoken form or spoken form is the input to imagery. The growth point is fundamentally both. What is very, very important is that the synchrony of speech and the stroke of the gesture, that part of the gesture with meaning, indicates the growth point, and it indicates how someone is thinking for speaking. Now we look at Spanish and English, so I'm just going to review some of the typological differences between Spanish, a verb frame language, and English, a satellite frame language, in speech and gesture. Spanish speakers describe states, and they tend to elaborate descriptions of settings in speech. English speakers, on the other hand, describe processes, and they tend to accumulate path components in a single clause. So let me explain that. So we can say in English, John went through the door, up the stairs, and into the room. There are three path components in a single clause with three prepositional phrases. Spanish speakers tend to focus their path gestures on path verbs and have separate boundary crossing gestures. Very important, separate boundary crossing gestures. They may have manner and gesture when there is none in the accompanying speech, and they may have manner only gestures. This is also important because often we say that Spanish speakers don't express manner if we just look at their written language or we just look at their speech. But if we look at their speech and gesture, we do see that they are also expressing manner. English speakers tend to focus their path gestures on satellites, accumulate path gestures within a single clause, and their gestures cross boundaries. They rarely have manner and gesture when there is none in the accompanying speech, and they modify the importance of manner in speech by either producing a path and manner gesture, so emphasizing manner, or producing just a path gesture or no gesture, thereby downplaying manner.
So I will talk about the instruction now. We used concept-based instruction, and in sociocultural theory, effective teaching that's attuned to learners' needs is what leads development. This type of instruction was based on Galperin's theory of developmental education from Vygotsky's theory of mind. And there are a few key components. The first being scientific concepts, which are high quality systematic knowledge. The second being materializations. These are visual and holistic depictions of a concept. And one example of this are scobas, and we'll show you an example of a scoba. Thirdly, verbalizations. These are where learners explain their understanding of the concepts and how they use them to guide their thinking and performance in activities. These activities are goal-directed practical activities, and they allow learners to use the concepts in a purposeful manner to accomplish language-related tasks. Our research question is the following: can concept-based instruction in L2 thinking for speaking promote a full shift from L1 to L2 thinking for speaking that encompasses the ability to appropriately express in speech and in gesture, path, and manner of motion in the new language? And more specifically, can speakers of a verb-framed L1, in this case Spanish, through concept-based instruction acquire the thinking for speaking patterns of a satellite-framed L2, in this case English? We had 7 L1 Spanish speakers who are affiliated with Penn State who are participants. In the pretest, they narrated 3 Tweety motion event episodes. The instruction lasted, they were 8 one-hour sessions where we focused on linguistic differences. Gesture was not mentioned at any point, nor were the pretest episodes used during the instruction. We videotaped all of the instruction and assessments, and we collected their notes. The post-test, we narrated the same 3 Tweety motion event episodes, and we added a transfer task, a more difficult task and a novel task using 1 mouse hunt excerpt. Here's an overview of the instruction, the 8 sessions. In sessions 1 and 2, we were raising their awareness. Sessions 3 and 4, we introduced the concept of motion event. Sessions 5 through 8, we introduced and practiced manner verbs and satellites. And I will go through a detailed explanation of each of these in the next few slides. So in terms of raising awareness, we had the participants view movie excerpts, some examples being Charlie Chaplin, Benny and June. There were a whole host of ones that had a lot of motion in them. And they wrote detailed narratives, later providing only manner verbs and satellites, to describe the motion in these excerpts. They then viewed native speaker narrations of the same movie excerpts, and they compared the manner verbs and satellites used in participants' narrations and in their own narration, and the native speaker narrations. Then they would re-narrate the clips. We also gave them images and other stimuli where we asked them to describe the motion in the picture in Spanish in a sentence, and then to do the same thing in English. And again, here's another example: describe the motion in Spanish, describe the motion in English. We then instructed them on the components of motion events, which are figure, ground, path, motion, manner, and cause. And here's where we used our SCOBA, which is on the next slide. Again, we use this same image, but we labeled it with each component part. So the figure is the ball, the ground, the net, the path, into, motion and manner with kick, and the cause in this case is our soccer player Shevchenko. And we labeled the sentence accordingly. We then gave them a worksheet where the components were defined, as you can see on the top of the slide here. And we gave them a number of examples, there's just a few on this slide, where we would give the English sentence and ask them to identify each of the components, as well as they would write the Spanish sentence and again, identify where those components are in their sentence. So we have the apple fell from the tree, the worm slithered across the lane, and a guy launched the pumpkin into the field. Then we were introducing and practicing manner verbs and satellites, and we used definitions, images, videos, sample sentences, and enactments. Here's just a select few of the images that we used. And here are some more. We divided the participants into two groups. One would enact a manner verb and the other would guess, and vice versa. And then they created stories using manner verbs and satellites, which they shared orally and also enacted.
We are now going to see one of the Tweety Bird excerpts as a pretest, and then we will see two participants' narrations of it as the pretest and the post-test.
I wish I got smiling, so it's like a morning spring. In the wind of Irish laughter, you can hear the angels sing. When I wish hearts are happy, all the world seems bright. Help! Help! The bad old putty cat is after me! Yeah, that'll teach you. Next time I'll give you what for. Bad old putty cat.
As you saw in the video clip, there are a number of motion events. Sylvester climbs up the cat outside the drain pipe. Tweety flies out of the cage into the house. Sylvester goes into the house. Sylvester climbs up inside the drain pipe. The bowling ball goes down the drain pipe, and Sylvester and the bowling ball roll out the drain pipe, down the street, and into the bowling alley. We're now going to see an excerpt of that narration, not the full narration, by Maracha. This is her pretest. Please pay attention to both her speech and her hands.
The building through like a tube thing, and then Tweety Bird threw like a bowling ball in the tube, and then the cat like fell out, I guess, and went into the bowling alley. The building.
Now we're going to see her post-test, the same excerpt.
And so then the cat rolled out of the drain pipe, down the hill, and into the bowling alley.
Okay, so what are some of the differences between her pretest and post-test? There was no use of the verb roll in her pretest. In her post-test, she used the verb roll, and she said rolled out the drain pipe. In her pretest, her path gestures occurred on a direct object, bowling, on a satellite and ground noun phrase in the tube, on a subject, the cat, and a verb and satellite fell out. In her post-test, all path gestures were on satellite units, satellites and ground noun phrases. In her pretest, she had no accumulation of satellites in a single clause. In her post-test, she had accumulation of satellites and path gestures in a single clause. Out of the drain pipe, down the hill, and into the bowling alley. However, she still had separate boundary crossing gesture in her post-test with into. We're now going to see another participant, China's narration of the entire Tweety Bird excerpt.
So there was Tweety, a bird, and Sylvester, a cat. Apparently Sylvester is trying to eat Tweety, and he's inventing different ways so he could reach to where Tweety was. I think it was in some higher floor. And the first time he does it, he goes like there's a pipe from, what do you say when you, up the pipe, and he gets to the window and he sees the Tweety singing, and then Tweety escapes from the cage, and he gets out, and his owner hits the cat and spooks him away from the window. And then the second time he goes up the pipe, but through it, not outside it. So he goes up there, and the little bird grabs a bowling ball and throws it also to the pipe. So the cat's going from downstairs to upstairs, and the ball goes from upstairs to downstairs. It gets to a point in which they meet, and the cat swallows the ball and then goes out the pipe, and he goes like rolling, like if the ball was rolling with him, and he ends up going into a bowling place you play your balls.
Okay, now we will look at her post-test.
So there's a little cat, a little bird,
Okay.
who's in a cage, swinging back and forth.
Okay.
His little swing, and the second image is like a cat who's downstairs, who decides to crawl up the pipe until he gets to the window where the little bird is singing. He leans on the window frame and starts moving his finger like back and forth, swinging his finger back and forth like he was directing the bird while he's singing. And all of a sudden the little bird realizes that the cat's there, so he screams. He flies out the cage into the house and starts screaming for help. And in the second picture there's an old lady helping the bird. She's hitting the cat with over his head with an umbrella and throwing the cat out the window to the street. Basically, you don't see the cat fall, but you hear him fall, and then you see the cat pacing in the street, pacing from back and forth or side to side until he decides that he wants to go up again into the pipe, like through the pipe. So he crawls up through the pipe and on the other side of the pipe the bird sees him doing that, so he grabs a bowling ball and he throws it into the pipe also. So they crash into each other, cat with the ball, and the cat rolls down because he swallowed the ball. So he rolls down out the pipe and down the street, rolling down the street into the bowling alley and hitting the pins. Okay.
So what are some of the differences between Sheena's pretest and post-test? In a pretest, she searched for the verb climb and used a path, manner, conflated gesture twice in place of the word. In her post-test, she used manner verbs crawl and roll, rolling. In her pretest, she used the manner verb roll with a manner only gesture. In her post-test, she used path, manner, conflated, or path gestures with crawl up the pipe and rolling down. She had no manner only gestures. So that's a shift to English. She had path gestures on verbs, verb plus satellites, and ground noun phrases in her pretest. In her post-test, she had path gestures on satellite units. A satellite, a verb plus satellite, or satellite plus ground noun phrase. And she had only 2 instances of path gestures with verbs, fall and swallow. She did not accumulate satellites in a single clause in her pretest. In her post-test, she accumulated satellites and paths in a single clause, flies out of the cage into the house, out the window to the street, rolls down, out the pipe and down the street, rolling down the street into the bowling alley. And very importantly, she had a separate boundary crossing gesture in her pretest, and she produced path gestures that cross boundaries in her post-test. So if we look at the changes that occur in their pretest, both participants exhibited Spanish thinking for speaking in English. In their post-test, they both showed a shift to English teaching, thinking for speaking, using English manner verbs, both accumulated path components within a single clause, and China had a boundary crossing gestures. So our take-home message is concept-based instruction, even short-term, can produce changes in thinking for speaking, which was not possible even in extensive immersion. The degree of change is likely affected by proficiency level in L2. And examining co-speech gestures is essential in determining learners' thinking for speaking and changes in thinking for speaking. Appropriate verbal production of motion event descriptions alone does not guarantee that learners are using L2 thinking for speaking patterns. Gestures and speech together reveal how learners are really thinking about motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gale and colleagues. That was very interesting. The contrasts in the two versions of the stories were very telling, I would have thought. It's very interesting to see this massive change with these learners. That's very impressive, I must say. So we have a question, I think. Renan, yes, please do ask your question.
It's striking how like we usually don't pay attention to gestures, and when we start looking at, oh my God, they are all the time. They are there all the time, right?
Yes.
Incredible. I'd like to ask, like, is it possible that the learners use the gestures not as a way to complement what they're saying, but as a way to try to remind themselves of what happened in the scene so that they can later narrate it?
Well,
later, but in a millisecond, like in a millisecond interval.
That's a really good question. Gestures have many functions. They're both for self and they're both for communication. So you're asking about the cognitive function in terms of helping the speaker. The problem with that is it's not that all the time, because gestures will both be redundant, so be the same as what is said in speech, or they will be complementary. They will add additional information that's not in speech, but is in the thinker's head. So it's not that the gesture creates a word, because in word searches, that's true. But otherwise, gestures are much more related to a concept. So I don't think so, you know. And when we look at gestures, we look very carefully to what that gesture is in fact doing and where the timing occurs. I hope that answers your question. I mean, gesture and analysis is actually quite complex. And I could give a talk all day on that, but, and it's a fascinating subject because once you start looking at gesture, you have realizations that you didn't have before.
Frybert has a question as well.
Yes, thank you very much, Gale and Kimberly, for a very nice and very clear presentation. One question, because maybe I missed, when were the participants tested?
So I'm sorry, go ahead.
How long after they watched the videos?
Immediately.
Immediately, okay.
And the span of the whole study was 3 weeks or so.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that? What is not terribly clear to me, I'm not so familiar with concept-based teaching. What is the particular active ingredient in the teaching method that you use? What is it that makes it special and that people actually get the hang of it so quickly? Because is such a problem with so many bilinguals, as we've already discussed today, who are exposed to thousands and thousands of occurrences, and they still don't really make this transition to the L2 patterns. And here you expose your learners to a couple of clips and you do some magic magic teaching and it works, right? So what is the magic in this teaching?
It starts with a really solid scientific concept. So if you can establish that, which takes a lot of time, I've done some other work on prepositions and other things in other languages as well, but that's the start. And then having some sort of imagistic depiction of it, usually trying to limit the number of words on the depiction. And then giving them lots of activities to try to use that concept in the way that they want to describe the language. And then having them talk about what do you understand and how are you using this in order to do the activity. And we've had a lot of success in many different areas. That concept-based instruction is now from anything from grammatical elements, as small as a preposition, to literacy, second language literacy.
I think Iraida has a follow-up question on this. So would you please ask your question?
Oh, sorry, I wrote them down. I had two questions. One was about the time elapsed between the pre-test and the post-test, and you said it was three weeks. And the other question I have about methodology, maybe I missed it. Sorry if I did. It's which level do the speakers have in English? Because you mentioned just they were learners, but which level do they?
So they were not tested, and that is a deficiency I recognize. But they seem to be, they were either high, intermediate, or advanced. And you can see that in the two examples I showed. Maracha was certainly at an intermediate level compared to Chino, who was more advanced.
Yeah, and also since you didn't test the level, how many years or how was the situation when they were learning English? They stayed, they were living there in the States, or it's just because if you didn't, and I'm just curious because the change and the level of English that they all the details about the way they describe motion events, even at the beginning, it strikes me as kind of advanced. So and I guess that the follow-up question about this is whether there were differences between the different levels that they have, the language levels that they have. So
I'll let you respond to that.
Yeah, they were living at the time in the U.S. And they had been living here for different amounts of time, but had some were students at the university, some were spouses of students at the university, but all had an intermediate or low advanced level. And
they responded all the same in the same way? Or you found differences in the way they changed the thinking for the speaking patterns?
Yeah, there were variations for sure.
Okay. We just showed you too, there were variations in it, and that's something we're still looking at because we need to correlate that with their perceived proficiency.
Yeah, it's just because in the studies that we had on the other side, with and the other way, the students are not so, I don't know, amazingly good in 3 weeks at acquiring all the, thinking for the speaking patterns, English thinking for the speaking patterns. And the other question I had, if I may, it's very quick. I guess it's also for the future. You presented here the test and the post-test using the same stimuli, the Tweety and the other one. So have you tested, or will you test, or are you going to test those students with a different stimuli using the same kind of motion events in the future to see whether those changes that they learned with the same clip are still there? I guess my question is whether those things that they learn so well in the clips that you show us are actually there in other situations where they don't actually know, new stimuli. That's the question. Thanks.
So Kimberly, you can respond after I do, but the mouse hunt was a new stimuli that they had never seen, and that was used in the post-test. In terms of launch, another post-test afterwards, we lost these participants after the study. Kimberly?
Yeah, the only thing I'll add is that if you've seen the movie Mouse Hunt, there is lots and lots of motion. It's significantly more difficult to describe the scene that we showed them than the Tweety. If there's a little mouse running through a maze and up and over cupboards and all kinds of different things if you know the movie. And so that was seen as a transfer test because it was more difficult.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. That was the question. Great study. Thank you.
Thank you.
Laura still has one question. Would you like to quickly ask your question?
It's a really quick question. First of all, thank you very much for your talk. It's I find this topic fascinating. So I just have one question. Have you tried to use this method on the other direction? I mean, with native speakers of English who are L2 learners of Spanish?
Not yet, but would love to do that in the future.